When we hear the word prophet, many times we think of one who can tell the future, one who predicts what's going to happen. And very often, when we hear the word prophet, we sort of associate it with that phrase, the prophet of doom. Very often, when we think of a prophet, we're not really sure we want to hear that person's message, because it will probably be to tell us to straighten out, or we're going to really suffer for it, or something as bad is going to happen to us if we don't change, or the world is going on a downward spiral and death and destruction await us. But I don't think that's the way the Lord intends us to understand the word prophet, because it's very clear, particularly in Jesus' teaching, that we are all, you and I, the youngest person in here, the oldest person in here, and everybody in between. We are all, regardless of whether you're a layperson or a priest or some kind of official in the church or whatever, we are all called to be prophets. So then Jesus has a little something to say about what it means to be called to be a prophet and what we need to do to answer that call wholeheartedly. Let's go first to the first reading. Two of the greatest prophets who never wrote anything in the Old Testament, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and a whole bunch of others, they wrote their prophecies out. They're preserved for us. Elijah and Elisha, they prophesied to kings and to the people surrounding the kings. And what they said, they carried the word of the Lord to them, to the people and the leaders, saying basically, the Lord your God is Lord alone. Trust him. Live in accord with that calling that you have been given to lead or to be God's people. Don't be playing around with other gods. Don't be following your own desires for power or prestige, for pleasure or for security. Trust in the Lord for all of those things and be faithful to him. That was the message of the prophets. They were speaking for the Lord. Now Elijah was getting old. He had been very successful. And you know how he measured success? By the amount of opposition that he got. He measured success by the fact that, no, he wasn't listened to. Nobody followed him, but nonetheless, he made it clear that the Lord's word was there and the Lord's word was alive. Now he was getting old. It was time for somebody to take his place. He receives a message from the Lord, go to Elisha. He finds Elisha with his farming equipment on what must have been a big and prosperous farm, because there were 12 yoke of oxen. Now, a yoke of oxen, it's two of them, bound together by a yoke, right? It's not like he had one plow and there were 24 oxes, pulling that one plow. No, it meant that he had a lot of assistants. And they each were plowing a portion of the field. So what does Elijah do? He wordlessly comes up to him, takes off the prophetic mantle, the distinctive garb that showed him as a prophet, and threw it over him. And that was a sign, you are my successor. Come with me. Elisha seems to be hesitant, but he's not really. He says, I've got to go and kiss my mother and father goodbye. What he basically meant was, I have to detach myself from all of this. I'm the heir of the farm. I'm the one to whom all this wealth will belong. And so he very simply gives a strong sign that all of the wealth that he had accumulated, all of his family's belongings, that he was letting go of them. Why? How? How did he do that? He took the 2 oxen that he was using himself for plowing, and he slaughtered them, and then used the plow. He destroyed the instruments of his prosperity. He destroyed the instruments of his wealth and made a fire from them and cooked the meat to give to his family, to give to his servants, to give to his fellow workers. That was therefore a strong sign that the past was going to be the past, that now he would be free to devote himself totally and wholeheartedly to the service of the Word of God by, first of all, assisting Elijah and then following in his footsteps. You can read all about them in the 1st and 2nd book of Kings. It's a fascinating, fascinating story. But let's fast forward now to St. Luke. Halfway through the Gospel of Luke, something very strange happens, and that's what we hear today. Jesus is ministering. Luke kind of condenses the ministry of Jesus into 2 parts. One up north in Galilee, in the country, the rich farming country, where there weren't a lot of really, really wealthy people. Their leaders weren't there, but they were the simple, ordinary people who needed to hear the Word of God. The second half, he's on his way to Jerusalem for his sacrifice. And then part of that second half is the last week he's there after Palm Sunday, and then his passion and death and resurrection. That's the second half of Luke's Gospel. Right here is the point where Jesus is up north in Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee, with his disciples, with his followers. He had already taught them. And he resolutely, Luke says, set his face to Jerusalem. Nothing was going to deter him from fulfilling his mission. So he starts this journey to Jerusalem. He begins to get from Galilee to Jerusalem. You can go a very roundabout way down by the Jordan River, or you can go more directly through Samaria. But Samaritans and Jews were enemies. They didn't like each other. And so he starts out going through Samaria, and the town that he was going to refused to accept him. They would not give hospitality. His disciples wanted to do the same thing that Elijah did to some of the evil servants of an evil king, and that was bring down fire from heaven. You can read about that in the book of Kings also. But Jesus said, no, have patience. That's not what I want to do. So he goes around. And actually, twice later in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus has one encounter with a Samaritan, one of the 10 lepers who returned to thank him, and that Samaritan turned out to be not so bad at all. In fact, he was the only one who thanked him. And then Jesus tells the parable about the Good Samaritan, where all the proper people avoided their duty to love their neighbor. And the one who was not really considered a neighbor, a Samaritan, helps the person who falls among, who needs help, who falls among the robbers. And so, let's not just take this one instance by itself. And then there were 3 people. One of them says, "Oh, I will follow you." Jesus doesn't tell him not to follow him, but he gives him the condition for following him. He says, "The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Even the birds of the air and the foxes in the field, they have a place to stay. I have none. If you're going to follow me, you must give up your attachments to the stuff of what used to be your daily life so that you can devote yourself directly to God." And then there's another one that Jesus himself says, "Follow me." And he says, "Well, I've got to finish my stuff here." And he says, "That's not enough. You have to follow me unreservedly." And then a third one, to follow him, he must abandon even his family. Now that doesn't mean that you give up, that we are all called to give up family and the things of our lives. But what it does mean is our attachments to those things cannot stand in the way of our being faithful to the Word of God, our being faithful to what God is calling us to. God right now is calling me to keep this homily short. So every single one of you, myself included, is called to be a prophet, to make the Word of God present. What do we have to do? We have to give priority to the Word of God. That means becoming acquainted with the Word of God, becoming familiar with Jesus in the Gospels and in the other writings of the Bible, and then doing our best to put that into practice with everybody we meet in whatever situation of life we are in.
A reading from the first book of Kings. The Lord said to Elijah, "You shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, of Abel-Mahala. Anoint him as the prophet to succeed you." Elijah set out and came upon Elisha, son of Shaphat, as he was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen. He was following the 12. Elijah went over to him and threw his cloak over him. Elisha left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, "Please, let me kiss my father and my mother goodbye, and I will follow you." Elijah answered, "Go back. Have I done anything to you?" Elisha left him, and taking the yoke of oxen, slaughtered them. He used the plowing equipment for fuel to boil their flesh, and gave it to his people to eat. Then Elisha left and followed Elijah as his attendant. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
A reading from the letter of St Paul to the Galatians. Brothers and sisters, for freedom Christ set us free. So stand firm and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery. For you were called for freedom, brothers and sisters. But do not use this freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. Rather, Serve one another through love. For the whole law is fulfilled in one statement, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you go on biting and devouring one another, beware that you are not consumed by one another. I say, then, live by the Spirit, and you will certainly not gratify the desire of the flesh. For the flesh has desires against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. These are opposed to each other, so that you may not do what you want. But if you are guided by the Spirit, you are not under the law. The word of the Lord.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. When the days for Jesus being taken up were fulfilled, he resolutely determined to journey to Jerusalem, and he sent messengers ahead of him. On the way, they entered a Samaritan village to prepare for his reception there, but they would not welcome him because the destination of his journey was Jerusalem. When the disciples, James and John, saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to consume them?" Jesus turned and rebuked them, and they journeyed to another village. As they were proceeding on the journey, someone said to him, "I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus answered him, "Foxes have dens and birds of the sky have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." And to another he said, "Follow me." But he replied, "Lord, let me go first and bury my father." But he answered him, "Let the dead bury their dead. But you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God." And another said, "I will follow you, Lord, but first let me say farewell to my family at home." To him Jesus said, "No one who sets a hand to the plow and looks to what was left behind is fit for the kingdom of God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you,